Hi, everyone. This week, I want to talk a little bit about poetry as performance, and particularly slam poetry, um, but also just this idea of poetry not just written to be read on the page, but written to be seen and observed and performed in front of an audience. So before we start talking about what slam poetry is, at its heart, in order to understand what slam poetry is, you have to understand that at its heart, it's a combination of performance poetry and activist poetry. So I want to start by talking about each of those, and then we'll finish up talking about slam poetry. And then for your reading this week, you'll be observing some performances by slam poets. So performance poetry, to take a definition that I found online that I really enjoyed, is that performance poetry uses the stage as the page. So instead of just writing it down, or you go to a poetry reading and someone's like reading from their book in front of them. This isn't these type performance poetry is meant to be more of a theatrical event. It's very resurgent. Recently, it's a reaction against the mainstream, but the style comes back from the classical role of the poet in history. It's meant to engage with an audience, and it's very interactive. It's common in what we would call pre-literate cultures, cultures that existed before the invention of the printing press, and what we consider written language, where stories and mythology were told through easier to memorize rhyme and rhythm, um, often sitting around a fire. In ancient Greece, we see a lot of drama, classic drama from ancient Greece is written through poetry, especially if you think about Homer, things like the Iliad, um, things like that. Those were written basically in poetry. They're written in rhyme and rhythm, and a lot of times in couplets and forms like that. So even when they're performed by a full cast, the cast is still speaking in rhymes. Much of classic drama was told through poetry, even things like Shakespeare, which is where a lot of musicals get their inspiration from. In the 1980s, the term was used to refer to poets who write exclusively for performance, not for print. Poetry of witness and activism poetry isn't necessarily written for performance. Sometimes it's written for the page, sometimes it's written for performance. But it's meant to shine light on what we don't talk about or what we pretend isn't happening. Those events that we're observing in the world. Carolyn Forche, who is the editor of this book that I have pictured on the slide, Against Forgetting, says that poetry of witness is an event and the trace of an event. And she says that it connects the political to the personal. She says we tend to think of poetry as either political, when we think about like military poetry or patriotic poetry, or personal, where it's more expressive poetry or love poems. But she says what we forget about is that space in between them. And that's what she considers poetry as witness to be, that space between the political and the personal, where everything that basically goes on in the world around us is experienced by us. And we use our poetry to write about these things. In a speech that I've linked in this slide, she said that poetry doesn't necessarily begin with a moral impulse. We are open to transformations. We write about what just like the spark inspires us to write about often. And we try to come up with a definition or a meaning to what's going around us by writing it down. But also that consciousness that she's talking about is often influenced by experience and seared by memory. And often those things that stand out the most to us are those things that we experience that we would consider not fair, or coming from a place of inequality. So this poetry of witness comes as a way of using poetry to write about these events that are going on in the world around us that maybe we don't want to think about. And if my cat's meowing in the background, I apologize. I'm homesick today, and this is what happens. So let's talk about slam poetry. And I don't have examples in this slide because you will be watching 3 videos by slam poets instead of reading just regular poets on the page. So the idea of a poetry slam is mainly a competition of performance poets competing against one another for, sometimes there's financial prize, sometimes it's just a matter of a competition. It was popularized in the 90s, but it's having a contemporary resurgence. Probably in the last, I would say, 5 years, it's become more mainstream than it was before. Even, which is funny because slam poetry at its heart is a rebellion against mainstream poetry, especially if we think about traditional academic nature of poetry, where you have a very specific canon of poets that you read from. You have a very specific idea of what a poem is. I know when I went to grad school, there was a lot of debate over whether or not prose poetry was poetry, for example. And even a lot of the faculty were divided. But also this idea that a lot of publications are very hegemonic. They seem to publish the same poets over and over again. Often poets that are published are, I would say, straight, cisgender white men. And even if someone who is not a straight cisgender white male is publishing poems, often they're writing poems from a form or structure popularized by a lot of our classic white male poets. Slam poetry is not meant for the page. It's often not written down at all. I know a lot of slam poets that I've seen perform, it's all memorization. Sometimes there are notes, but they're nothing that's meant to be published, because the publication here is the performance. Often they'll touch upon social issues that are important to the poet. A lot of poetry slams and slam poets are those writing on the edges. They're marginalized writers. And they're writing about their experiences and the social issues that have shaped their experience. And it seeks to give a literal voice to some seemingly voiceless topics: race, gender, sexuality, poverty, and also things like bullying. There's a really wonderful resurgence of poets writing from the fat activist spaces that I've really enjoyed. Often their performances are heavily influenced by music, especially hip hop. When you think about the rhythm necessary to get a good performance, and they're full of emotion and passion. Often they may sound angry and loud. Sometimes they're softer, but there's this idea of emotion coming out through the tone of voice. And they're a lot of fun to watch. If you're interested, the site Button Poetry, button like on your clothing, has a lot of really wonderful slam poet performances. TED Talks will have a lot of slam poets, since it's becoming more mainstream than it has been previously. And the ones that I'm linking for you all to read today or view today are from poets that have a greater body of poetry. The first one you'll be looking at is Hannah Drake, who's a Louisville poet, who's getting some national recognition for her slam poetry. So that's a very, very fast overview of a very complex topic that could be much bigger, but because you're going to be watching other videos this week, I didn't want to throw another long instructor video at you. I just wanted to give you a brief introduction. I hope this helps. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out and let me know.